So mindfulness of the body is probably the most famous of the 4 foundations of mindfulness. It's the one that's had the most influence. And we'll discuss it coming right up. Hey folks, so I'm Doug Smith. I'm study director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. And if you're new to the channel and interested in helping to try to promote a wiser and a kinder and a less stress-filled world, consider subscribing to the channel. We'll discuss things like mindfulness, which I'm going to touch on right now. I've done past talks on mindfulness in general, but here we're going to zoom in and focus on what's probably the most important of the 4 foundations of mindfulness, which is the first one, mindfulness of the body. And we'll begin with the first part of the Buddha's essay on mindfulness, where he talks about the definition. And there's a number of different aspects of the definition, which I won't get into, but one of them is that we're supposed to approach mindfulness, as he says, free from desire and discontent with regard to the world. Now, to an extent, this is at least reminiscent of the idea that we're supposed to abandon sensual desire and ill will, which are 2 of the 5 hindrances that keep us from getting meditative attainments, and in particular reaching the concentration you need for jhana, which is meditative absorption, which is not really germane to this topic. But in his wonderful book on the topic of mindfulness called Satipatthana, the great scholar and monk Analayo, and I'll be really relying on his book a lot for this talk, and I highly recommend it. I'll put a link to it down below. Analayo says that, it's not really so much about those 2 aspects, but rather more just in general about liking and disliking. In other words, in order to approach mindfulness in the proper frame of mind, we have to, at least to an extent, for a time, put aside the idea of liking and disliking with regard to the world and with regard to the experiences that we have of the body in this particular case. Of course, hopefully we do expect to get all the way, but at the beginning, at least try to put those aside. Try to put your likes and dislikes aside and just pay attention to the phenomena. So then he tells us what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to sit down, he says, underneath a tree or in an empty hut, cross our legs, and put our mindfulness in front. These are very simple instructions. There's nothing about the lotus position, which a lot of people sort of fetishize, I think. There's nothing about the way you're supposed to cross your legs. There's nothing about putting your hands in a particular mudra or a particular form in your lap. There's nothing about your hands at all, in fact. So there's clearly a wide range of possibilities when you're doing mindfulness, at least in the early tradition. And by mindfulness in front, again, a very open kind of description. Most people take that to mean you're supposed to sort of pay attention to around the mouth area, the nose and the mouth, because you're doing mindfulness of breathing, perhaps. But I think, in a broad sense, it's just to say, look, don't be having your mind sort of float off somewhere else. Don't be thinking about what's happening in some other part of the world. Just keep your attention right here, right in front of you, and that way you'll be doing mindfulness properly. And after having said that, he then gets into mindfulness of breathing, which is, let's be clear, only one small part of the entire description of mindfulness of the body. I think for a lot of people nowadays, mindfulness of breathing is really the entirety of Buddhist meditation, and certainly the entirety of mindfulness. And that's, that can be very useful, of course. Mindfulness of breathing is probably the most fruitful. It's certainly the one the Buddha says you turn to all the time, but it's far from the only practice we're going to see today. So he says you should be mindful of breathing in short and breathing in long, and breathing out short and breathing out long. And you're supposed to be mindful of the breath filling the whole body as you breathe in and emptying the body as you breathe out. And you're supposed to be mindful of, as he says, calming the bodily formation. Now, the bodily formation, that is a technical term, which in the early texts basically means the breath. So mindful of calming the breath, calming the way the breath is exhibiting itself in the body. And here already we can see we've gotten a number of different options for practice that are quite different. I mean, one of them is to follow the breath in the whole body as it comes in. Think of it as filling the body and exiting the whole body. One of them is to be aware of the length of the breath, whether it's short or long. And one of them is to be aware of calming the breath. To an extent, I think a lot of us sort of go right beyond these or right past them without even thinking. But I think it can be useful sometimes just to focus on one of these and sort of see how you can do with it. Another thing we'll notice in his description of mindfulness of breathing is there's no reference to counting the breaths. Counting the breaths comes from the later tradition. It comes from, in particular, the Visuddhimagga, which is a very eminent text by Buddhaghosa, who was probably the greatest expositor of the tradition and sort of collator of the tradition from the 5th century of the Common Era, so a full 1,000 years later. Presumably this idea of counting the breath came up in the meanwhile, and he's just writing it down. But at least we can see, if we go back to the early tradition, there's no discussion of counting. So this is basically all he has to say about mindfulness of the breathing within the context of the Satipatthana Sutta, or the 4 foundations of mindfulness. Now we get to the refrain. Now the refrain is something that is repeated over and over again. After each section he repeats this refrain. And the refrain is that we're supposed to contemplate this internally and externally, and that we're supposed to contemplate its arising, its passing, and its arising and passing, and a number of other things. Internal and external is something of a dispute. There's something of a controversy about what he really means by that. It might mean that you should contemplate breathing internally within your own body, as well as thinking of yourself in the third person, seeing yourself from outside, as it were. It might mean that he wants you to think of it from your own internal sense and think of it in other people, and then external in the sense of think of it the way other people are doing it. It's not entirely clear. But what is clear is that this is supposed to be an objectification of these experiences. In other words, we're supposed to see them as part of the world, as part of the causal structure of reality, and not try to cling to them. Another way of getting to that is that we're supposed to see, again, their arising and passing and arising and passing. That is, we're supposed to see the way in which they are impermanent. That is, these are supposed, our experiences should all become, within the context of mindfulness, should all become examples of impermanence. And that is the way that mindfulness eventually leads into insight into the aspects of experience, and eventually insight into awakening. Because to the extent that we can come to understand this impermanent nature of all of reality, then we will hold it without clinging, we'll hold it without identification. And indeed that's what he says at the end of the refrain, is that we're supposed to abide independent without clinging. If we see that the world is always changing, we see that it's not self, we see that it's not part of any kind of permanent self, then we understand that it's not I, not mine, not myself in any kind of a permanent sense. So having talked about a mindfulness of breathing, then he talks about mindfulness of postures of the body. So whether we are walking or standing or sitting or lying down, or however our posture happens to be, we should be mindful of it, be aware of the posture of our body. And a lot of people will say that this shows that you can do, let's say, standing meditation or walking meditation or meditation lying down. You don't only have to be sitting. Even though in mindfulness of breathing he talks about sitting with crossed legs and your back upright, it's clear that you can do mindfulness in any of many postures, and indeed the Buddha himself talks about doing a walking meditation. So after having said that, then he talks about the refrain again, that we're supposed to be aware of its arising and its passing, we're supposed to be aware of it internally and externally, and so on. Then he talks about mindfulness of activities, and this is even more active than the last. It's not just the positions, but the activities that we should be mindful while we're doing. So whether we're walking, going away somewhere, whether we're coming back, whether we are eating, whether we're drinking, whether we are just tasting, whether we're going to the bathroom, whether we are talking, whether we're silent, no matter what we're doing, we should do it mindfully. We should be doing it in full awareness in the same sense. And this, I think, is where mindfulness comes together with right action and right speech and right effort. Because if we are mindful of our speech, then we're gonna try to do right speech. We're going to try to involve ourselves in right speech. And if we're mindful of our actions in general, then we're going to be mindful of not doing wrong actions, not killing, not stealing, and so on. And I discussed both right speech and right action and indeed right effort in previous videos, so if you're interested you can go back and see those. They are 3 parts of the Eightfold Path. And these, I think, show explicitly, definitely, that mindfulness meditation is not something that's only to be done in formal meditation. And by formal meditation I mean sort of sitting on a cushion with your eyes closed and your hands in your lap or something like that, or sitting on a chair with your eyes closed. That's formal meditation. And of course, we can do mindful meditation doing that, but if he says we should be mindful while we're talking, well, clearly we can't be doing formal meditation then. So what he's saying basically is that mindful meditation, this first foundation of mindfulness, this mindfulness of the body, is something that we have to bring into all of our life. So the next part, after we assume the refrain, the next part is contemplation of the anatomical parts of the body. And here, at least in the contemporary tradition, is where people tend to find an example of what's called a body scan meditation. So in contemporary mindfulness practice, we often will be told to do a body scan, which is where you begin, let's say, at the soles of your feet, and you sort of go up the body. You look at your soles of your feet, then the tops of your feet, then your ankles, then lower legs, or one leg at a time, and you work your way up the body until you get to the crown of your head. And it's either an example, a practice of awareness, of simply being aware of the state of the body, or it can also be a practice involved in calming the body or in relaxing. And it can be an example of lowering stress, as we've discussed. It can also be an example of trying to go to sleep. If you're having trouble sleeping, that body scan practices, it can be very useful. But I think it's important and interesting to note that in the early tradition, that was not the point of this contemplation. Because in the early tradition, this anatomical parts contemplation was not really about the felt exterior, but rather about the, I would say, conceptualized interior. That is, that you were supposed to conceive of your anatomical parts being your internal organs, your liver and your heart and your spleen and phlegm and bile and pus and all this sort of negative stuff, which is, gross, disgusting for a lot of us, and that was the point. In other words, it was a contemplation of the impurities of the body as a way of lessening sensual desire particularly within monastics, but within anybody, presumably. And the point was not to think of the body as ugly. The point was to think of the body as not beautiful. And there's a difference, because to think of the body as ugly is to react against it, is to react with aversion. And that was not the point of this meditation. The point of this meditation was to say, look, the body may look beautiful to you, but if you look at it in a different light, it's not so beautiful. It has parts that are, let's say, quote-unquote impure, that's the word they used, parts that can be looked at in different ways. And again, that's a way of sort of looking at the body and saying, there's nothing here to cling on to, there's nothing here to identify with. We should stop the normal tendency to identify with our own bodies or with the bodies of other people. And here the Buddha gives a simile, and a simile of the body as like a sack of different kinds of grain with two openings, one on the bottom and one on the top. And I think we know what those two openings are supposed to be. And he says, in the same way, you can go through that sack of grain and say, here's one kind of grain, and here's another kind of grain, and here's a wheat grain, and here's a bean, or whatever. In the same way, we can go through the body and look at all the internal organs and say, here's this kind of internal organ, here's this kind of internal organ, and so on. That is to say, it's a practice of objectifying the body as simply another part of the world, as not clung to as mine, as I, as who I am, but as simply a sack of grain with two openings. Then he moves on from that to talk about an elements meditation. That is, we can also meditate on the elements of the body, not the body's internal organs, but the fact the body is made up of, in his day, the elements would have been earth, air, fire, and water. Now in our day, we can say that we know the body is made up of, I don't remember how many chemical elements. And we can do the same kind of thing. We can say that the body is made up of, let's say, a liquid element and a gaseous element and a solid element and a warm element. Or we can say that the body is made up of carbon and calcium or water and everything else. And here again, the Buddha gives a simile. He says it's as though there's a butcher who's at a crossroads and he's cut up a cow into pieces and he's selling the pieces of the cow. In the same way, you can think of the body as made up of pieces, of parts, parts of one element, parts of a different element. Again, this is a kind of a way of objectifying the body as something that's not I, not mine, and not myself, but something in its elements that partakes of the world. We exchange elements with everything around us. We exchange the elements in the air with the air around us. We exchange the elements of water when we drink something, or when we go to the bathroom, when we urinate, and so on. And finally, what's probably the most difficult for a lot of us in the West is he ends the discussion of mindfulness of the body with what can be called nowadays charnel ground contemplations. So in ancient India, many people, they would have disposed of corpses by two methods. Either they would have burned the corpse, or they would have simply disposed of the corpse in what's called a charnel ground, in a ground where the corpse simply would rot away and be eaten by vultures and so on, and go back into its state of earth and ground. And so what we're supposed to do for the Buddha is, if we can, and in his day they could, they would literally go to a charnel ground and contemplate what was in front of them. But he gives you a number of sort of an outline of what you can do even if you don't have a charnel ground around you. So he says to contemplate the corpse, the bloated corpse in decay, which is, again, hard to do. It's something that we shy away from. He says we should contemplate bones that have skin on them. We should contemplate bones without skin. We should contemplate bones scattered around. We should contemplate a pile of bones and bones decaying into the earth. And all of these are different ways of contemplating our own death and decay. Very, very, I think, problematic for many of us, very difficult for many of us. Some of us may even find this very disturbing and may shy away. But I would urge you not to, because the point of this is to come to terms with our own mortality. And what he says at the end of this passage is to contemplate all of these with the thought in mind that I too am like this, that this will also befall my body. Again, it's an attempt actually to objectify the body as something that's not mine, because it will be around after I'm gone. It will be decaying into the earth. It's something that we do have to come to terms with, one way or the other. Either we come to terms with it in a state of open-mindedness, in a state of mindfulness, in a state of wisdom, while we're sort of sitting quietly and being able to contemplate this, or we're going to have to come to terms with it in a more difficult state of mind when we are at death's door or when somebody that we love is dying. And of course, if part of the insight involved in this kind of practice is to be aware of the fact that all things change, that nothing is permanent, that all things will pass away, the charnel ground contemplations are in many ways the most important and most deep of the contemplations within mindfulness of the body. And so I think it is something of a shame that they're either looked down upon or simply forgotten within the contemporary Western tradition, although of course I can understand why. Many people in the West are not really very attuned to our own mortality. It's the sort of thing that happens out of people's sight. It happens in a hospital, it happens in another place. It doesn't happen in front of us, and to the extent that it does, we tend to react against it. We tend to be very aversive towards it, with perfect reason, perfectly understandable. So that, in a nutshell, is mindfulness of the body within the early tradition, within the Satipatthana Sutta, which is where this mindfulness is first and most elaborately put forward. So how do you practice mindfulness in your daily life? How do you practice mindfulness of the body? Do you do mindfulness of breathing? Do you do one of these other practices as well? Do you find them useful? I'd be interested to know, and I'm sure other people would be as well. So please put your comments and questions down below. Thanks so much for your kind comments in the past. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one of these videos. So bye-bye.